What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Homie Hangout, where we help others move in excellence. And if you haven't been here before, like, subscribe, all the other stuff YouTubers want you to do, and let's get into it. So, there's been some conversation lately about the credibility or the value of people speaking on cultures or ethnicities or geographies, regions that are not their own, right? And should that be tolerated? Should that have any credibility? And I don't think it's a simple yes or no answer. And let me explain real quick. I cannot speak on what it is like to be somebody else, right? Somebody with a different lived experience. I cannot speak on what it's like to be an immigrant, right? I was born here. So I can't speak to that. I can't speak to what it's like to live in Los Angeles. I've never lived in Los Angeles. I've been there, but I've never lived there. And so there is a limit, right? And sometimes people get carried away and they talk about a certain group or whatnot as if they belong to that group. And I think that's wrong. I think that should be unacceptable. I don't think there's a lot of value to that because the nuances of identity you haven't really experienced, right? You may have observed, but you haven't experienced. And so that I think that should be, out of bounds. However, the idea that people can only speak on issues that they identify with that are their issues, so to speak, or cultures or regions that they have as much history with as somebody else strikes me as odd, right? And just not practical. I'll give you a quick example, personal example. My daughter is fascinated with Japanese culture and the Japanese language. She speaks it. She has learned a lot about it. She has a lot of Japanese friends. She is not Japanese in the slightest, right? She can't say what it's like to be a Japanese person. She can say what other people have told her, but she needs to be careful to make sure that she doesn't imply she's speaking from personal experience. But she has taught me a lot about Japanese culture. She has taught me some Japanese words, which I'm not going to use here because I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. But so she has taught me. And what she has taught me is true. It is honest. It is factual. But she's not Japanese. And so if you look in school, especially if you look in college, there's all kinds of people teaching classes that don't necessarily line up with their kind of multiple identities, right? Because we're not just one thing, you know, it, our ethnic background may be one thing, but then our lived experience is different. Our environment growing up is different. Where we grow up influences things about us that are different. And so we're not just this or just that. We're a complex combination of things. And so to reduce somebody's value to only speaking on that specific group of different identities, again, it's just kind of foolish, to be honest. And I understand where it comes from, right? Because there are people that speak down on other cultures. There are people that misrepresent things. There's people that tell false histories, right? So there are definitely people who have no business speaking on some of the groups that they do, but that doesn't mean that nobody has any business speaking on those groups. I am not from Southern California, and I will talk about Southern California at times. And when I do, I only speak about it from my understanding, my experience, and I leave it open to people to correct me, inform me better, right? And so it's limited. It has its boundaries. I can't tell you what it's like to grow up in Los Angeles. I can tell you about all the people I've met from Los Angeles and the conversations that we've had and some of the similarities that it seems like we have between how I grew up and how they grew up. I think that's fair game. I think that's reasonable, right? But again, there's boundaries, there's limits, and especially at a time when groups are getting together. And I'll talk specifically about North and South, but I'm gonna talk about other groups in a minute. North and South is building bridges. No matter what people think of it, no matter if you like it or not, and if you have that perspective or not, the reality is in the state of California, there is a greater, more healthy relationship between folks in the North and folks in the South. If what you consider to be healthy is unity, right? And at minimum, an end to conflict based on geography, right? There's always going to be people that don't get along, but an end to conflicts based strictly on what half of the state you're from or what half of the state you identify with. Personally, I'm a huge fan of that. I don't operate within the geographical constructs that I did when I was a gang member or that I did when I was in prison. And so I respect those who do, and that's fine. That's your business. I don't. So I feel comfortable speaking about things because I'm not speaking from a Norteño perspective, from a Northerner perspective. I'm speaking just from my perspective of my experiences. And I've had experiences with a range of people. Doesn't mean I know it all. Doesn't mean I'm always right. I make an effort to be, and I'm open to correction. Another aspect is, talking about other races, right? Talking about Black folks or talking about Asians or talking about Polynesians, whatever. I grew up in an area that was a mix, right? We had a lot of raza, a lot of people, of Mexican descent. We had a lot of Central Americans, a lot of Polynesians, specifically Tongans and Samoans. Some Asians, though I didn't interact with them a whole lot. Um, and and yeah, and a lot of Black folks, right? And all of us were in the same economic class. So we had something in common because we were all broke, right? And then culturally, there was some things that were similar and there were some things that were very different. So I learned a lot about those groups. I don't pretend to know very much in the grand scheme of things, but I know a little something. And I know a lot of other people have the same experience, right? And so this isn't so much about me, it's my take on this situation, but I know that I'm not the only one who thinks this way or who has had these experiences. And so I can share a little bit from that, right? Of what it was like growing up with different groups. Now, that doesn't mean that's what it's like for everybody everywhere growing up with those groups. That's what it was like for me. That's what it was like in my area. And I know a lot of other people had a similar experience, right? So I think that's fair game. That's fair game. And it's fair for other groups to talk about the groups I identify with, right? Um, it I speak more authoritatively, maybe for lack of a better term, about the North, about Norteños, about the Bay Area, because that's where the majority of my experience is, so to speak. Right, those were groups that I rocked with, that I participated in, that I functioned with, and so both in the streets and in prison. So I could share a little bit about that. Now, my experience being a Northerner in the streets is not anything like somebody's experience being a Northerner in the Salinas streets, right? Or in the Modesto streets, or even in the Sacramento streets. Because those geographic areas, even though they're all up north and folks like the same numbers and colors, there's a difference there. So again, there's boundaries to what we could speak to. But I can speak to what it's like to be a Northerner in general. I can speak to what it's like to be a Northerner and a Norteño in prison in general, in the time frame that I was in there and how stuff was when I was there. And but I don't mind other people speaking on that, right? It's there's plenty of folks from the South that speak. There's Southsiders and Sureños that know far more about the Norteño cause and all this other stuff than a lot of Northerners. In prison, we make it a point to study other groups. I've read a ton of Black Panther literature. I can tell you what that literature says. I can't tell you what it's like to be a Panther. I can tell you how I interpreted it, how I applied it to my life, tell you about the people I learned it from and how I learned it. So, but that's not my culture specifically, right? That's not my racial group. And and so I just think there needs to be some caution, really, in discrediting somebody simply because of them not matching what you expect them to match when they speak. Because when we do that, we lose out on valuable information. We lose out on learning. and learning is important for all of us, and we all have more to learn than what we already know. And so that's all. It's like I said, a short video, but those are my thoughts. And I feel free, leave comments and let me know. And I'm sure some people are going to disagree, but I just think that the hard, fast rule of if this is not your identity, you can't talk about it. Now, is it my place to talk about the details of Sureño business? No. Maybe as that overlaps with Norteño business, maybe. But even that's kind of getting into an area that isn't really my business because I'm not in that lifestyle anymore. But I have some interest in it. I've learned some stuff about it. So I tend to stay away from that stuff. I will talk about current events happening in prison, the end of hostilities and that sort of thing. But that's not to speak on any group's business. That's to speak on a culture shift within prison. And I happen to have been in prison, and that stuff is new and it's interesting. And so I have some thoughts around it. But there are specifics that should be out of bounds for people. And when you start talking about prison gangs or organizations of that nature, then yeah, you got to be careful, right? Because you don't want to step on somebody else's toes. You don't want to put information out there that they don't want out there. Now, sometimes people don't like history, and that's just kind of too bad, right? But in terms of current events, yeah, I would suggest caution. I'd suggest caution speaking on any group, even if it's a group that you have a history with. And so this is my 2 cents, man. Take it for what it's worth. Maybe it's a nickel. I don't know. Help others move in excellence. That's what homies do. Help yourself at the same time because you're worth it. Help your community because they need you. And again, if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, dislike, and subscribe. I don't care. Check out the other content, man. There's a lot to it. Take care.